Everybody has one. There's a whole internet subculture dedicated to it. Television idents and logos that scared the crap out of you as a kid. Don't pretend you didn't have one. For me, it was Channel 4. Not because of the animation or the logo, weirdly alien and inscrutable though it was, but because of the music, which sounded like Channel 4 was angry at me personally for doing something far too terrible to contemplate. Had I been born a bit earlier, the logo of my nightmares probably would have belonged to the looming, baleful Yorkshire Television.
This is Yorkshire Television in colour.
Yorkshire, often known on screen as YTV, is the television equivalent of Firestorm the Nuclear Man, the DC Comics superhero whose secret identity is actually two people. Unless that's changed since they rebooted the universe, I don't know. Yorkshire Television's secret identities were Telefusion Yorkshire, a rental firm looking to expand, and a consortium calling itself Yorkshire Independent. The Yorkshire franchise was created in 1967, effectively amputated from Granadas' purview when the ITA's chairman Lord Hill grew uneasy about the dominance of the Big Four, the companies that launched ITV and still broadcast it to the vast majority of the country. The vast northern franchise uniting Yorkshire and Lancashire was served by two of them, Granada at weekdays and ABC at weekends. In the initial race for the licence, Telefusion and the Yorkshire Independent Consortium finished, respectively, in first and second place, although they were undoubtedly helped by the obvious frontrunner Ken Dodd and Diddy TV withdrawing early. Anyway, this being pre-1990, money wasn't yet everything. Telefusion had the cash, being backed by the successful rental chain, but the ITA weren't convinced they had the broadcasting chops they needed. Yorkshire Independent, meanwhile, were backed by the Yorkshire Post, a handful of trade unions and a co-op, and therefore were relatively skint. But they had demonstrably the better talent and the better plans. What to do? Had this happened 25-odd years later, of course, Telefusion would have been handed the franchise on a silver platter just for having the most money. But the ITA of the 60s was still concerned with their television channel being worth watching, and so it was agreed to merge the Telefusion and Yorkshire Independent bids together in a shotgun marriage. For whatever reason, neither party seems to have had too much of a problem with this, and the new company was given the typically plain-speaking name of Yorkshire Television. It launched on the 29th of July 1968 with an ident employing the then-fashionable slit scan technology. This turned out to be about as animated as it got for the first 20 years or so, as you'll see. The music is adapted from the traditional Onilkli Mór Bartat, a stark warning about the dangers of walking the dales without headwear. Apparently to do this is to court certain death, and then everyone in Yorkshire will point and laugh at you for being a soft southern pillock, while partaking in a grim northern version of the Circle of Life. The pointy logo was known as the Chevron, and no one was quite certain what it was supposed to be, although the general consensus was that it was a stylised Y for Yorkshire. It certainly bore little or no resemblance to anything anyone else in the country was using. It was definitively Yorkshirean. It also went through a bit of evolution. Here's an early version in a picture that's actually less distorted than you might be thinking. This thing actually predates the station itself. Yorkshire, with Great Northern efficiency, were already making programmes before they even started broadcasting. Mostly schools programmes. This fat-ass version of the Chevron is what would show up before those. Now at this point, some people may be remembering that I started this thing by yammering on about how supposedly scary the Yorkshire ident was, and are currently wondering what the hell that was all about, because so far there's been very little in the way of raw terror in this episode, Ken Dodd's face notwithstanding. And it's true, this initial Yorkshire ident isn't scary in the least. The music is a little ominous, but not Channel 4 level. and the animation is relatively subdued. More importantly, the animation is existent, which is why this ident isn't the one hundreds of kids found so scary in the 70s and 80s. This being Yorkshire, they swiftly realised that they were just too double-bastard hard to need an animated form-up, and they didn't bother with one again until the mid-80s. And that is where we get the legend of the terrifying Yorkshire ident. Yeah, after all that build-up, it can't help but be underwhelming, but context is everything. Imagine yourself as a small child in Sheffield or something, circa 1971. A trailer fades to black, and you immediately tense up, because you know what's coming, and you know there'll be no warning, and here it comes and it's going to get you! That was the power of the Yorkshire ident. The brass fanfare and the logo smash cutting out of nowhere. Think of it this way. If you're alone in a room and suddenly out of nowhere someone directly behind you yells, "Ah!" you'll turn inside out with fright even if it turns out to be your 98-year-old grandmother. Same principle here. The lack of any sustained build-up, combined with music that sounds both triumphant and vaguely annoyed at you personally, is a perfect storm when you're about 6 to train you to fear your television forever. This surly and uncompromising combination of still picture and angry fanfare served for an ident for many more years, looming out of the darkness to terrorise a generation or two of flat-capped youngsters. And to make matters worse, Yorkshire, almost uniquely out of the entire ITV network, almost never used in-vision continuity announcers. Except for a brief period in its first 18 months or so, Yorkshire never had visible faces. This was all you'd get. They did have some of the best voices in the business, however, chief among them the legendary Redvers Kyle, defecting from rediffusion.
The YTV clock tells us it's exactly 25 to 1 o'clock and we're now closing down. So on behalf of all of us here, this is Redvers Kyle saying look after yourself, sleep well and a very warm good night, especially to you.
Kyle, very much the dean of continuity announcers in the UK, is the sort of man you turn to for the announcement of a nuclear war, because his dairy milk smooth voice would be a comfort in civilization's final moments.
This is Yorkshire Television, broadcasting from the Emley Moor, Belmont and associated transmitters of the Independent Broadcasting Authority.
He stuck with Yorkshire for 30 years before retiring in 1998. At 86, he's still around now, no doubt waiting for that 3 AM call from the government. But the cuddliness of the announcers' voices couldn't offset the stark, looming, impersonal nature of the ident. Sometimes it would even fade up, and then wait half a second before bellowing that brass fanfare, just to keep you on your toes. And it wasn't just the kids in Yorkshire who had to suffer this, because in those days your ident would show up nationwide to introduce the shows you've made, making watching Emmerdale Farm, for example, something of a test of nerve. And wouldn't you know it, Yorkshire soon established themselves as one of ITV's major producers of networked programming. As well as Emmerdale Farm, which came along in 1972, they would go on to give the world the likes of Rising Damp, Flambards, Harry's Game, The Darling Buds of May, the Beiderbecke trilogy, the great Les Dawson's very first TV vehicle, Countdown for Channel 4, and, as if to balance it out, 3-2 Tossing 1. Which does get props for including the ident in the title sequence. Yeah, turns out that unexpected animation makes it scarier. And it wasn't just light entertainment. Mostly, but not exclusively. One of the earliest shareholders in Yorkshire Television, buying into it shortly after it began broadcasting, was the late Alan Wicker, the unflappable travel guide, international playboy, and moustache god. He stayed with the network until his semi-retirement in 1992, and provided them with their serious factual backbone. And YTV weren't just a hit factory, they were pioneers. Their original studios at Kirkstall Road in Leeds were the very first purpose-built colour studios in Europe, while in 1977 they invented, of all things, breakfast television, by starting up at 8:30 instead of 9:30 with a fistful of cartoons, some repeats of Peyton Place and the news under the name of Good Morning Calendar. While this ultimately failed to outlast its 9-week trial period, it probably got the IBA's antennae twitching. Yorkshire also led the way in sports broadcasting, being one of the first companies to invest in decent outside broadcast equipment, which meant that viewers could finally make out the number on Peter Lorimer's back properly.
To Lorimer, may hit one from there. A goal! Oh! A typical Lorimer effort!
Less than 10 years later, Yorkshire were at it again, inventing 24-hour television by linking up with their cable sister station, Music Box. When this failed, they went with an hour of teletext job listings instead. But the late nights are, of course, another story.
This story shall also be told.
Yes, all of a sudden the Dales were abuzz with culture and entertainment. They were also abuzz for much of the 70s with swearing and anger, as Yorkshire fought constant battles with the unions, perhaps surprisingly given the presence of several trade unions and the co-op in the original Yorkshire Independent Consortium. Strikes were, of course, far from exclusive to Yorkshire Television, particularly in the 70s, a period when, had a day gone by without someone at least threatening industrial action, it would have made national news in itself. Yorkshire, however, is one of the more traditional homes of the working class. A lot of modern socialism and trade unionism was born hereabouts, in the steelworks and the coal mines, and discontent had been brewing in ITV for some time. Ever since the 1968 shake-up, in fact. The transition had not been the smoothest it could have been, and what started out as a relatively minor dispute at Tyne eventually spiralled to engulf almost the entire network. Most notoriously, Yorkshire's fellow 68 New Boys LWT had been broadcasting for approximately 15 seconds, and I mean literally 15 seconds before the screens went blank. Eventually, almost every technical member of staff across the network walked out, and ITV was forced to broadcast an emergency national service for 3 weeks. This consisted of some perfunctory news and whatever repeats they could get their hands on, linked by the Thames continuity team over a bluntly utilitarian slide. It was quite exciting for a time. That was eventually resolved, but Yorkshire continued to have problems. One night in 1970, gritty northern workers expecting to see news at 10 instead got this. Eventually, new chief Paul Fox, poached from the BBC, was able to settle things down. Part of the reason for all this fresh unrest in the 70s was a major change in Yorkshire's corporate makeup. UHF broadcasting was now a thing, and it required new transmitter stations to be built. One of these was to be at Blisdale, in North Yorkshire, right on the eastern edge of YTV's territory. Although Yorkshire lobbied hard, the ITA gave control of it to Tyne, reasoning that it covered more of Teesside and County Durham than it did Yorkshire. YTV cried foul, and a protracted and very boring argument broke out for several years that was finally settled via a pair of compromises. First, the Belmont transmitter was to be taken from the blameless Anglia and given to YTV. Second, a holding company, Trident Television, was to be formed to take control of both Yorkshire and Tyne from the 1974 franchise round, on the condition that the two companies were entirely separately run, sharing a common parent company but nothing else. This was almost a first for ITV, and certainly it felt quite weird and even vaguely exotic to see another company's name underneath the station logo at the time. Trident didn't last, however, and barely 2 World Cups later the companies were separated again by the newly rebooted IBA, with the transmitter dispute apparently long since resolved. Maybe they drew a red line down the middle of it, I don't know. So now it's the 80s, and that Channel 4 graphical revolution I keep talking about has happened. Yorkshire's response was... To be fair, this isn't completely identical. They have re-recorded the music in a very, very slightly softer arrangement. And also, to be fair, they may not have been in vision continuity, but throughout the 80s several variant versions of the idents kept cropping up, mostly bigging up the fact that they had the largest broadcast area by population, as if it was entirely down to them that Yorkshire was so bloody big. That faintly unsettling optical illusion came along in 1983. A couple of years later, with computer graphics now cheap and practical for all the family, they went with a theme of historic counties in space. James Blish, eat your heart out. The newly three-dimensional chevron and lettering represented a minor sop to the new Channel 4-led CGI revolution, but the ident itself still didn't do anything except glare out of the screen like the damn sentinel. It wasn't until 1986 that the ident would finally go animated on a permanent basis, and they were determined to make it worth the damn wait. Liquid gold, and if you can't figure out why it's called that, I'm surprised you know how to turn on a computer, cost a staggering 40 grand. And that's 1986 money. Was it worth it? Well, it's certainly an original take on the by then obligatory 3D form-up, and the music is much improved by being more fully orchestrated. It would get even lusher if slightly less stringsy on the special ident created to celebrate Yorkshire's 21st anniversary. The 21st anniversary was always considered a special one for a TV station, though I'm not sure why. Traditional age of adulthood, I expect. Since Liquid Gold was so involved and epic, they eventually developed a simplified sister ident consisting of just the chevron revolving in a patented TV ident type void, for those occasions when they simply couldn't be asked, showing the whole thing. Then 1989 came along. Perhaps surprisingly, considering how much they spent on Liquid Gold only 3 years earlier, Yorkshire actually readily agreed to the imposition of the generic look, even though their version of the logo didn't really work properly either. But then they did gradually alter it to make the region more prominent, until the ITV logo vanished altogether. And quite right too, in my opinion. They held on to the generic ident in one form or another for quite some time, 5 years in fact, longer than most franchises bothered with it, and certainly long after ITV itself had stopped caring either way. The adoption of the generic ident was to herald troubled times for the station, however, as the 90s arrived to shake up ITV completely. ITV survived the 1991 blind auction franchise round more or less intact, but with a not insubstantial monthly bid of £33 million, which is a pretty hefty amount to take out of the annual budget and hurl into a sacrificial pit. Next door in the northeast, Tyne were in a similar situation. The obvious thing to do would be to resume their alliance from the 70s, this time under the po-facedly functional name of Yorkshire Tyne Limited. Technically it was a merger, but by and large only in the same sense that B-Sky B had been a merger. The big fish ate the little one. This obviously had more ramifications for Tyne than for Yorkshire, so most of the story will have to be told in Tyne episode. Suffice to say here that within a year of the merger, questions were being asked in Parliament about what had happened to the North East's ITV service. And it didn't even work as the financial rubber ring it was supposed to be, as the company was making colossal losses, largely through desperately overselling advertising space. They eventually managed to steady the ship with the partial help of this man, an old friend, Bruce Gyngell. Bruce was of course now out of a job, having turned TV-AM into simultaneously the most successful and least pleasant to work at TV station on earth, before being bitten on the arse by the very laissez-faire economics that had got him there in the first place. Having both lived and died by the sword already, he had exactly the right combination of experience, mind-boggling success, and absolute dead-eyed reptilian evil that the beleaguered Northern Alliance was looking for. On arrival in 1995, Gyngell faced a familiar problem: a television station with almost no money whatsoever. No problem for the notoriously tight-fisted Gyngell, a man whose first edict at the penniless TV-AM was to slash the minuscule budget even further. The selling of advertising was outsourced to LWT of all people, and of course several hundred people lost their jobs, mostly, as it turned out, for Tyne teas. But Gyngell's biggest impact at Yorkshire would actually turn out to be visible on screen, as he proposed to completely revolutionise ITV branding across the board by creating a completely new identity to replace both the Yorkshire and Tyne teas names. Channel 3 was born, complete with cheaply rendered ident and ill-fitting and obvious library music. Channel 3 Yorkshire and Channel 3 North East were intended to be just the start of Gyngell's inevitable conquest of Britain itself, but he hit a snag when the YTV board balked at doing something so obviously stupid and tasteless. So instead, Tyne Teas, the bitch network, was ordered to take on the new branding wholesale and to see how it worked for them, while Yorkshire tastefully dipped a toe in the water without fully taking the plunge.
You're watching Yorkshire Television on Channel 3.
Again, more depth will come in the Tyne Teas episode, but the point is, it was rubbish and it was stupid, and everyone hated it, except Bruce Gyngell, which of course meant that everyone loved it. Yorkshire had only relatively recently changed their idents anyway, having been rocking their version of the ITV generic ident for 5 years. So in 1994 they refreshed themselves with what was very much their classiest look. 2D was back in vogue by now, and just like they did with the last graphical revolution, Yorkshire managed to put their own spin on it with these slightly rustic seasonal confections, which, if they had an aroma, would probably smell vaguely of Hovis. The biggest surprise was the music. The old Ilkley Moor-derived fanfare failed to make a comeback. The new tune was kinder and gentler, but it didn't last, as only 3 years later Gyngell's highfalutin Channel 3 idea was in full bloom, and the ident changed back to 3D CGI again, with a rather tacky and cheap looking animation. If you could buy idents at Lidl, they'd look like this. At least they brought back the traditional fanfare, albeit again in a cheap and nasty arrangement. But this exercise in off-the-shelf branding stubbornly refused to catch on, because it was stupid and ugly. And Gyngell eventually washed his hands of it altogether when Yorkshire Tyne teas were bought out by an increasingly imperialistic Granada. Granada's first move was to tear down the Channel 3 branding, stuff it in a flaming box full of razor wire and hurl it into the North Sea, which was a blessed relief for Tyne teas, but only a minor change for Yorkshire, as their ident only changed in as much as the backdrop became less tacky. This was probably just thrift on the part of Granada, though. I mean, why go all out to create a new set of idents when you know they're only going to last a year?
Good morning and welcome to Yorkshire Television.
But this time it's not quite over. Although Yorkshire were forced to accept a generic look that was even less sympathetic to the regional companies than the last one, they wouldn't give their identity up without a fight. In fact, they hung on to it for grim death, adopting a special set of specifically Yorkshirean idents for use before specifically Yorkshirean programming, which by then basically just meant calendar. But of course this was just delaying the inevitable. Eventually, the black hole of Carlton and Granada sucked the rest of the ITV network into a singularity. The key word being sucked. Like the other franchises and most of the other companies, Yorkshire Television technically still exists, but only as a dormant subsidiary of ITV plc. Its televisual legacy is pretty enormous and pretty impressive. But what if it survives today? What's the last remaining specifically Yorkshire programme on the network? Just what has the entire legacy of Yorkshire Television been boiled down to?